So welcome everybody. We have a big group here this morning. So we have been doing this kind of ongoing Sunday school class, going through this book. Have you guys ever seen this book at all? Anybody? So this is obviously it says On Guard from William Lane Craig, but this is a very basic apologetics kind of class. You guys know what apologetics means? Yes. Okay. Anybody want to give me a definition? It's like school, right? You say, yeah. Do you know the answer? Yeah. Okay. Tell me the answer. Oh. Come on, man. So apologetics means to give an answer. So, and we talked about how we're supposed to be able to give an answer for the hope that we have within us. So we're in a nice spot here because we just finished. So if you look at the book here, it starts out talking about what is apologetics, and then the second chapter we talked about what difference does it make if God exists, right? So if there is no God, then what does that mean for everybody? Like, what are the consequences of that? And then the next few chapters have been giving arguments for the existence of God, and these are all deductive arguments. You guys remember what deductive arguments are? No.
It's like say you start out with like 5 options and you're taking away all the illogical options, so you're just left with 1.
Kind of like to deduct in math means to do what? To subtract, take away. So deductive arguments are arguments where you start with a very broad premise and you narrow it down to a very specific conclusion. And the deductive arguments are very powerful because if your premises are all true and you don't make any logical mistakes, the result of the argument, the conclusion of the argument is inescapable. That has to be the way it is, right? So if for example, the first argument that we talked about, if I remember, is the Kalam cosmological argument. All right. Oh, no, it's the Leibnizian argument. But the Kalam was the chapter 4, right? So everything that begins to, premise 1 is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2 is the universe began to exist. And the conclusion is therefore the universe has a cause. That's a deductive argument, right? Very broad. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And these are all arguments that are drawn from philosophical reasoning or scientific reasoning, and they all lead us to the point that there is a God. And I said at the end of the last class that we had that narrows the field down. At the beginning of this class, we talked about, I have it written up there. We could take all religions and put them into 3 basic categories. God made all, God is all, and no God at all. Right? So all religious beliefs you put into one of those 3 categories. And so if these arguments that we've talked about in this book are correct, that leads us to the conclusion that only one of those categories is still on the table, that God made all. So all the other options, God is all and no God at all, aren't on the table anymore, if these arguments are correct. So there are 3 what are called monotheistic religions, which mean that they believe that there's one God. What are the 3 monotheistic religions?
Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
Right. So that's all that's left on the table. So if God exists and there's just one God that created everything, those are the only 3 religious systems that we have. And so we have to decide from those 3 which is true, which we will get to, right? But the next chapter that we're talking about is one of the biggest objections against God's existence, and that is the objection of evil and suffering. Okay, so before we even get into that, which I want to get into that today at some point. So that's chapter 7 in the book, if you're following along. But I wanted to take, since we just finished giving all these positive arguments for God, I wanted to take a couple minutes and ask if anybody has any questions or anything that you'd like to talk about before we kind of move on from this.
Yeah, so question.
Yes.
So in my philosophy class, one of the books that I was reading up on, it mentioned something about this example about integers and how they go infinitely, and because of that, you can have like infinite amount of causes for the universe.
Well, okay. Remember we talked about infinities before, and we did the cause, like when we talked about the kalam. Remember we said that there were two lines of thinking of why we believe that everything has, like, that the universe began to exist, right? And remember there was the scientific one. So all this, remember the one video I showed you where they talked about how a universe that's in a state of expansion can't be infinite in the past, that it had to have an absolute beginning. And so from Einstein's general theory of relativity and from what Edwin Hubble discovered, that the universe is expanding, essentially you could rewind all that and it brings you back to the singularity, and that's where they come up with the Big Bang and all that sort of stuff. But like there had to be a beginning scientifically. But then there was a philosophical argument. So even if you put that stuff aside, remember we talked about the difference between an actual infinite and a potential infinite. Remember that?
I don't think
So the argument is that there is not an actually infinite number of integers. There's a potentially infinite number of integers.
Oh,
So if you take the whole set of integers or numbers or anything like that, it's not like there's a you can say here are the numbers, because you could never number all the numbers, right? You could always add one more.
right.
Right? So it's potentially infinite, but you never reach infinity. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So to say that there's a potentially infinite number of anything, that doesn't help the case. So then what's the connection between having an infinite number of integers and the causes of the universe? What did they
They
say?
try to say that because we try to say that everything had to start from somewhere. Like they're trying to say like why can't there just be infinite number before that, and then it would just lead up to this moment, kind of like that, and with the numbers.
Right. So again, but think about that. Could we count down from infinity to get to today?
No.
Why? Right? Does that make sense? This is a little bit heavy, but that makes sense? Like there's no starting point. It just goes back forever. You can just keep going back and back and back and back. So how did you get to today? Like there had to be a beginning of it all.
I'll have to
Right?
start.
So like there had to be a zero, like 0.0,
Okay.
where you
I see
start
how it's
counting
flawed.
from, right? So like, and again, if you take the scientific evidence and the philosophical evidence, the burden of proof really is on them then at that point. Like what model can you propose where, and I'm going to show you a video. Well, actually, no, we were watching something this morning. Like to say that the universe began uncaused out of nothing is to say that it had no, remember there's two types of effects, or two types of causes. Remember what the two types of causes are?
Intrinsic and extrinsic, or like intrinsic in like the necessity of its existence, or something created outside of its existence.
Okay, not quite. Like intrinsic means from within, right, and not extrinsic. But the two types of causes we talked about were the physical cause of something. So if I had a statue that like the statue of David, have you ever seen that over in Florence? Michelangelo's David statue. You've seen it.
Probably have.
It's probably like the most famous statue in the world, right? So there's a material. Then what's the material cause of that statue? It's the marble that it's made out of, or whatever. That's the material cause. Now the other cause is the efficient cause. So what's the efficient cause of the statue? Michelangelo, right? Because he's the guy that sculpted the marble. So when you get to the universe, to say that it just popped into being is to say that it came into being without a cause. How does that work? And then the question then would be, if the universe can just pop into being without a cause, then why doesn't that happen all the time? Why don't things just pop into existence all around us without a cause? Because you can't, that's special pleading to say that, well, that only works for universes. Well, why doesn't it work for, Ferraris? It just popped into my driveway this morning. I don't know. It's just there. Mr. Taxman, I have no idea how it got there. It just appeared. Like, no one would believe you, right? So, does that answer it? Maybe help at least. Any other questions about anything? I don't know that I can answer it, but we can talk about it. This is like pre-back to school for a lot of you too. So if you're anticipating any conversations with your friends, we can like debate prep.
I have a class, my freshman seminar at college is about this book called Revolutionary Love. It was written by a rabbi. And basically in the book, he says, if everybody loves each other and acts unselfishly, we can have a utopia. And I'm like, that's not going to work. Like, he believes that everybody is intrinsically good, is what he believes. And so he believes that if everybody like unlocks their intrinsic good, that we can basically alter the Constitution and make a new utopia based on love and care. And then everything will be measured, he calls it a new bottom line. Everything won't be measured by its profit, but by how much it like cares and loves for the rest of humanity. But I'm like, but your basis is that we're intrinsically good and we're not intrinsically good. So it's not going to work until we have a perfect leader, a perfectly loving leader, which won't happen until Christ returns.
Right. So if I was to challenge you on that, which I think you're right, how would you know that his starting premise that people aren't good is not a true statement?
You mean people are good?
The people aren't good. How would you say that that's not true?
Empirical evidence, mostly from like everything that's happened in the world. Like, even when people have the opportunity to be good, or he essentially argues for like he calls it a post-socialist environment. But in the past, when things like this have been attempted, they never work, simply because people are intrinsically selfish, like we're desperately wicked. And in the end, if we have to choose between acting for ourselves or acting for others, we're going to act for ourselves without God's help.
Right. So I would say, like, remember the coherence test for truth. Remember we talked about that? You ever hear the coherence test for truth? So at the beginning of this, we talked about how truth exists. And again, I had a conversation just this week with the guy that I teach with, and he was like, well, we all have our own truth, which is what everybody likes to say. Like, you have your truth, I have my truth, everybody has their own truth. And I said, well, that's like, you don't believe that. He's like, I said, well, does truth exist? He's like, no, we all have our own truth. I was like, well, again, is that true?
Yeah. What did he say?
He was like, he didn't get it. And I was like, think about what I just said. Like, if you say that that's not true, I'm believing that, or you're saying that you believe it's true that that's not true, right? Like, you can't get around it. And I said, and again, to say that all truth is relative is making an absolute truth claim, while you're at the same time denying that there is no absolute truth claim. Like, you can't, it's self-defeating, right? So we talked about the test for truth, and that there's the correspondence test, which says, like, if I want to know, is this a remote? Yes, because it corresponds with the definition of what a remote is, right? If I push the TV and push a button, it does stuff, right? It's a remote. Okay, so that's correspondence. The other was the coherence. Remember, we said, is it logically consistent? Is it empirically adequate? So you talked about that, right? How if you look at the data of human history, would you ever come to the conclusion that people are good? And then remember, the third piece of that is what? Logical consistency, empirical relevancy, or empirical, I forget what the right word is. Is it empirically verifiable? That's it. And then the third one was what? Do you remember? This is what I'm saying. Like, for the people who are in my class, I want you to get all this in your head so you can whip this stuff out, right? Is it experientially relevant to me? Does it match my experience? So when I experience other people, do I find them to be naturally bent towards the good? When I look at myself, do I find myself to be naturally bent towards the good? And this is how I deal with my kids at school. I'm like, has anybody in here ever known something to be wrong, but you did it anyway? Raise your hand. Every single kid raises their hand. I'm like, There we go. Why is that? That's weird. Because if we're all naturally good, that shouldn't be like that. Okay, so that's a problem. The other problem is, on an atheistic worldview, what is good?
There's no basis for it.
There's no basis for it, right? So it's totally subjective, and that's what we talked about the last couple weeks. What does subjective mean? I should define that.
That's opinionated.
Just my opinions, my beliefs, what I prefer, compared to objective, which is true regardless of what I think about it, right? It's like it's true, right? Not up to me to decide, right? So when we talk about flavors of ice cream, we're talking about something that's subjective. Who's the best football player in the world? That's subjective, right? If we talk about whether or not the Bible's true, that has nothing to do with my opinion. It either is true or it's not true. My thoughts or beliefs about it are irrelevant to whether or not it's true. That makes sense? So that's objective. Okay, so what's good? Like, and even that, like, if you're saying that you've reached utopia, again, you're saying that you're measuring that based on some standard, right? That this is the best possible society. How do you get to the best possible society, right? So you see the whole thing just starts to crumble, right? Because you're like, what's good? What's utopia? Who decides what utopia is? Maybe your utopia is like hell on earth for somebody else. Like, who knows, right? That's just your opinion. When you talk about, like, are people really good? There's a guy named Malcolm Muggeridge who has a famous quote that says, the depravity of mankind is the most intellectually verifiable fact, but the most, how does he say it? The most objectively verifiable fact, or something like that, but the most intellectually resistant fact. Because if you're an atheist, you have to believe that humans are perfectible and that we can make things better, because otherwise, what are you left with? Nothing. It's just like we read from Bertrand Russell, remember? Only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair can the soul's habitation be henceforth be safely built. So, all right. Any other things? Good question. Yeah. You're like, is every Sunday like this? This is like too heavy. All right. So before he talks about, if you look at chapter 7, before he gets into actually talking about suffering, he has a little section about, remember the Louis Wolpert, and I showed the clip last week where he talked about Wolpert, and he remember, like, the guy's like, you haven't given me any evidence. He's like, I gave you 5 arguments. But then there's this other idea that atheists have now trotted out, that they want to make atheism as like the default position, so that everyone's an atheist. And like, unless you conscientiously or consciously make a deliberate decision to believe in God, then everyone by default is an atheist. And that's why he has a picture on page 150 of his cat, Muffy. Muff. So Muff is an atheist, according to that definition, which is ridiculous, right? So I wanted to show you, I like to show some videos in this class. So I want to show you a video. This is, and I asked Noah if this was okay to watch this, because it's thug life. And again, like, really, this is not the goal of apologetics, right? To like conquer your enemy and make them look bad and stuff. So whoever edited this video, like, they put the horns every time he hits a point. You're like, you know. So again, it's funny, but we don't want to do that in life. Like, I got you, I got you again. And then at the end, he has the gold chain come down and the hat. So we'll stop that. But the conversation is worth watching, right? So this is an older clip. Oh wait, I have to share it.
Isn't it actual channel?
It is an actual channel, yeah.
No, for like this specifically, like I've seen this for like Ben Shapiro or something.
Yeah.
I've seen it for this specifically, this funny.
Where's the other tab?
Go down there at the bottom, hover over it, and then
This?
it's the big one.
Oh, the big one, all right.
There you go.
Thank you.
Oh, I see now.
All right, that's not what we want.
Advisory, yeah.
You have to click on it. You have to click on that. Okay, right there, click it.
All right. By the way, we record these, so as soon as I get my helpers to help me get these down, we're backlogged on these.
I'm
So
waiting on those.
once we get the backlog done, I have 2 helpers here that are going to help me get it off, hopefully, and then
One
the editor.
helper
And we'll put them all online. So if you're like, I would like to find out what happened before I came in today and fell into the deep end of the pool, you can watch all those. All right. Here we go. So we're not going for the apologetics.
There's a lot of talk about the burden of proof, and I just wanted to point out firstly that you cannot prove the non-existence of a thing. And naturalists accept this, but the problem is when you invoke God as an explanation for that, what you're doing is you're invoking something that is inherently inexplicable. Thereby, you're not solving the problem, you're not explaining anything, you're confounding the problem. You have more to explain. And I just want to ask you, do you think that invoking God as a hypothesis about natural things or the origin of life or the origin of the universe, I think that's an advancement to knowledge?
Now, repeat the first part of the question again, because I disagreed with what you said there.
It is impossible to prove
That's right.
the non.
It's impossible to prove something does not exist. That's silly. Of course you can prove something does not exist. We can prove, for example, that there are no living Tyrannosaurus Rex on the face of the earth. We can prove that there are no Muslims of the United States Senate. Or, as Dr. Shook says, if you can show that something is a self-contradiction, he's in the house. Yeah. You can show that something is self-contradictory, so there are no married bachelors. So this is an atheist line that you hear on the popular level all the time, but that sophisticated atheists don't take, because it is easy to prove that things don't exist. Now the question is, if it is the case that you can't prove that God does not exist, then you shouldn't be a naturalist. You should be some sort of agnostic or something, but you shouldn't go around saying things like, nature is all there is. There is nothing beyond matter and energy. There is no supernatural reality, because those claims exceed what you yourself say you can prove. So you need to make more modest claims about your position that are more simply agnostic or something, and find a new name rather than naturalism, because that isn't something that you can sustain the burden of proof for. Now, the last part of your question assumed that I was presenting God as some sort of an explanatory hypothesis. And if you look at my arguments, they're not like that. These are deductive arguments. Now, what that means is that if the premises are true, that the conclusion follows logically and necessarily, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's explanatory or not, it doesn't matter. All that matters is, are the premises more plausibly true than not? Because if they are, then the conclusion is logically unavoidable. And so, yes, I think they definitely represent an increase in knowledge. This is an example of deductive logical reasoning. And it can't be impugned by saying that it's not some sort of explanatory inference to the best explanation or something of that sort.
Before the chain comes down.
Oh, no, that's my favorite part.
I want to show you.
There's an issue that I perceive as severely problematic by any theist point that involves the fact that every single person in this room, and in fact every single person on this planet, is an atheist.
Now, what this guy's talking about, sometimes if you watch these debates and stuff, the people will go on and say, like, you're all atheists in regard to innumerable number of gods. right? None of you believe in Thor, Zeus, or Hermes, or all these people as gods. And so I'm just an atheist for one more God, because I don't believe in the God of the Bible. So you're all atheists. It's just that I'm an atheist to one more step than you. That's what they'll say, right? So that's what this guy's going to say. Okay.
Many times over in regards to the pantheon of gods that have come before. And the reality is that the people that believed in these gods believed it with every bit of fervency that anybody in here might believe in the Abrahamic God. And there's a problem there because none of those gods are any less likely, quite frankly. None of them are any less rational. They're all irrational. The fact of the matter is the possibility of Zeus existing is no less likely than the possibility of Yahweh. And I think it's a serious problem that I think has to be addressed, and it never has been to my liking ever.
It's easy to address. Definition of atheism. Remember, I'm going to read again from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. According to the most usual definition, an atheist is a person who maintains that there is no God. That is, that the sentence God exists expresses a false proposition. Therefore, in no sense am I an atheist. Just because I deny the existence of Odin and Thor and Zeus and Hermes doesn't make me an atheist, because to be an atheist, you need to believe the proposition there is no God. And I believe there is a God.
Sorry, but that's semantics.
Excuse me?
That's semantics.
No,
You're
sir,
arguing
it's not. This means that you believe a universally quantified statement. There is no such being as God. And I don't believe that, because I do believe that there is a God.
So use a word other than atheist, it still comes to the same thing.
No, what you have been led astray by a common sort of internet infidel talking point that is given to atheists to use against theists to make it seem like the atheist claim is less radical, that everybody is an atheist about other gods. And that's simply not true, because to be an atheist, you have to believe there is no God at all. And I don't believe that. So in no sense am I an atheist. Now, you've simply asserted that belief in Odin and Thor and Zeus and so forth is no more rational or irrational than belief in classical theism. That's what this whole debate in a sense has been about. And to show that, you would have to refute all of my arguments. And you're welcome to do that. I think these arguments are sound arguments, and they're incompatible with the existence of these deities that you mentioned. So I'm willing to stand on the evidence that I presented.
I'm going to show you one more there. Come on, man. A little. Yeah. Let me pull that out. I pulled this up for just because it pertains to the whole. There are a lot of people today that don't believe in God. So
concisely show an atheist or agnostic that they hold beliefs as well. So a lot of times they just say that you just have beliefs and I don't have those beliefs. But how do you concisely, just in one statement, show them that they actually hold beliefs and that those beliefs are blind faith?
Well, you'd have to be on some sort of topic like, do you believe, I might ask them, do you believe there's an immaterial realm? Or do you believe everything's just made of molecules? I would just ask that question. If they say everything's just made of molecules, I would ask them, is that statement that you just made of molecules?
So just trying to, again, like you said yesterday, flip the
Yeah.
question on this.
Yeah, because everybody, even though they may claim that everything's made of molecules, they don't live like that. Because they don't think, for example, their spouse or their children are just a bag of chemicals. Right? They think that they're special human beings. And they believe in love. In fact, in one of the debates I have with Christopher Hitchens, someone from the audience asked Christopher, what is love? What is it ontologically? In other words, how would you describe love? And Hitchens finally had to admit that according to him, love was a chemical. And it caused you to act in a certain way towards somebody else. And I said, go home and tell that to your wife. I just got the chemical today, honey. Tomorrow I might not have it. And if that's the case, if you think about this, if love is just a chemical, then how can you hold anybody responsible for anything? In fact, if we're not moral creatures that make moral choices, how can we hold anybody morally accountable for everything they do? I mean, Hitler just had bad molecules, right? According to that theory of materialism.
I appreciate it. Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, Matt.
So that leads us into the argument from suffering. And you could say suffering or evil. You could use it either or. Okay. Did I show the video about the problem of suffering the last class? Noah keeps telling me that I did, but
No,
I
not
feel
the
like-
one in the beginning.
no, that was that was if God doesn't exist, but I didn't show the whole video on it. All right, so how about I'll show this. There's two parts to this. So I'll just show you the first part today. Because again, at the end of these chapters, they have a flow chart, and he breaks this up. There's the logical problem of suffering and evil, and then there's the emotional problem, right? So that you have to kind of deal with where people are coming from, because you can just give them the cold answer, like, well, this is the way that it must be, but that oftentimes isn't helpful because they're suffering, or something terrible happens to somebody, like, well, God must have a reason for it, like, all right, so let me show you the first video.
There's a lot to, it was coming up in my book in philosophy, the problem of evil.
Yeah, this is one of their the biggest.
This is the second.
Is this the second one? This is one of the biggest challenges.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Suffering.
But again, you have to, because we're coming off the chapter on morality. So like, before you dive into this, you always have to kind of keep in mind that whether you call it suffering or evil, if you get rid of God, how does that help the problem? Well, there's still standard for suffering, right? Suffering, like, no one wants to suffer. But if you suffer and there's no God, so what? Right? Like, you can't blame anybody, and it doesn't matter. There's no point to it. It's not like you can find some meaning in the stuff. You can make it up if you want to, but like, there just is. So too bad, right? So by arguing against, and the same thing we talked about too, if you say that evil disproves God, because the argument is like this: if God is perfectly good and God is all powerful, yet evil exists, there's some disconnect. That's the argument, right? Because if God was perfectly good, then he would get rid of evil. But if he can't get rid of evil, then, and if he was all powerful, he could get rid of evil. But if evil still exists, then that tells us either God's not perfectly good because he lets evil exist, or he's not powerful enough to get rid of the evil. So therefore God doesn't exist. But if there is no God, again, what's the first problem?
There's no measure of evil.
Yeah, there is no evil. Because if you don't have God, you don't have an objective standard of morality. So, right, you're just molecules in motion, it doesn't matter. Okay, so you have to always kind of keep that in mind, and they'll talk about that here.
Unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil, but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another.
It's probably in your book.
Some philosophers have
Yeah,
contended that the existence of evil
I haven't seen
is
that being
logically inconsistent with
Voltaire,
the existence of a theistic God.
This guy Kierkegaard.
No one, I think, has
Or
succeeded in
Kierkegaard.
establishing such an extravagant
Yeah.
claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
So that we'll watch that next time. But Voltaire, for example, he he had a famous poem that he wrote about there was an earthquake and a tsunami in Lisbon, Portugal, and he always mocked. Remember the Leibnizian argument, like why does something exist rather than nothing? Well, Leibniz also said that he thought that this was the best possible world, and that God created the best possible world. Like, I don't think there is a best possible world. Like, this is the world that God chose to create, given what he knew people would freely do. But like, could he have made another world that was equally like the same number? Sure. I mean, it seems like, how do you decide that there's just one? But like Voltaire loved to mock the Bible and the church, and his whole
with deism.
yeah, his whole book Candide was mocking Leibniz's idea of the best possible world. So, and Mackey writes a lot of stuff about the problem of evil. But again, remember the one thing that they said you'd have to show that free will doesn't exist. What's the opposite of free will? So if you don't have free will, then it must be the case that all of us are what? Most robots, to say it one way, but what does that mean? Remember,
Controlled by something?
by
A deity.
our DNA and stuff, right? We're all determined. But remember, if you want to argue against free will, what's the problem with that?
You're choosing to do that, which is an act of free will.
Yes, right? You can't argue against free will and say like, I'm determined to believe that free will doesn't exist, and how'd that make any sense, right? Because you didn't decide that, you're just doing what you're already programmed to do. So there's no rational thought. If you're determined, you just do what you do, right? So that's why they said that they can't, there's no way to argue against it.
And if everything's determined, there's no point in debating it because it's already determined what you're going to believe.
Right,
So there's no point in even debating anything.
right. You're not going to change anyone's opinion because that's what they're determined to believe. So again, those are all, like, I want you to see, like, these are all the consequences of getting rid of God. If you get rid of God, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you get rid of God, you can't say like, well, I still want to keep free will, and I still want to keep objective morality, and I still want to keep meaning and purpose in my life. You can't do it, right? All those things go away. So where do you go with that, right? All right. Any final thoughts, questions today? So we'll just close with prayer. Lord, we just thank you for this time that we can think about these things. Some of them are a little challenging, but we pray you'd help us as we seek to know you better and to use the knowledge that you give us to help share your love for others with them. We pray that you would help us to be a good witness and testimony to our friends and people that we interact with, that we could tell them about the gospel and tell them about the great love that you have for them, that you sent the Lord Jesus to pay for their sins, and that they can have their sins forgiven by trusting you as their Savior. We thank you for this food now that we're about to partake of, and we pray that you would bless it to our bodies. And we pray for, again, this baptism this afternoon. We thank you for that, and we just commit these things into your hands. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.